Okay. So welcome everyone. This is our first of our workshops on our field days, Connect, Grow and Serve. As we've said, on Saturday we had a great kick-off with Vicky Balabansky doing a Bible study on Colossians, and that is now up on the Presbytery website with links there, and we've set up a YouTube channel where we'll put all these videos for later use. Through the week, we've got, so the week will end with another keynote from Deborah Guess from Pilgrim College on eco-theology, the church and the environmental crisis. And by then we'll be getting more and more familiar with the eco-theology and not so scared of the term. And throughout the week, we've got 5 sessions running across. And again, I'd encourage people to have a look at those on the website and information about them, but all different aspects of it. And it's great to have Tim Angus and Tanya, who are leading tomorrow night's session here with us tonight. And tonight we have Wendie going to lead us through God So Loved the World, thinking theologically about creation. So I'm going to stop my share and hand back to Wendie and ask God's blessing on our session.
Amen.
Okay, everyone. My original brief was to think about eco-theology in terms of work we might do in the congregation. So that's I'm going to be doing 2 things tonight. One is to say something about eco-theology and talk to you about a particular book that I think is really useful for congregations, and then to share some resources with you, as many of you I know are leading worship in various places, and my thinking was that as leaders in our congregations, one of the ways we can begin to talk about this topic at a congregational level is through worship and through our studies that we might do. So that's where I'm going with all of this. And if I share, and so I just want to read you a prayer to begin with. God, our creator, you who laid the foundations of the earth, you for whom the bright morning stars sang together, and to whom all your children shout for joy, today we praise you. You who commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and shake the darkness out of creation, today we praise you. You who put wisdom in the clouds to give understanding to the mists of the morning, who scatter the 4 winds over the earth, blow your creative breath through this group, that we may always praise you. And that's a poem from a resource book, which I'll tell you about in a minute, based on Job 38, which is a great hymn of creation in so many ways. So let me share my screen with you. That PowerPoint, I think that, can you see that?
Yep.
Folks?
Yeah.
Can you see my PowerPoint? No.
Yeah, we're seeing the actual full screen. So yeah, you know, you're going to go.
Yeah, I'm just about to start it from the beginning.
There you go.
Okay, I've turned it For God So Loved the World, Eco-Theology in Congregations in Worship and Study. Okay. And I've done the opening prayer. The book that I did a course in eco-theology about 20 years ago in Sydney, and also became very interested in this whole area, particularly when I went to Albany in Western Australia, where there was quite a lot of interest in this idea of a theology of creation and a concern for the environment. And so the two went well together, and we actually used this book in the local congregation, and it comes with a series of studies with it, which I'll also talk to you about. But I thought it echoes a lot of what was said on Saturday, but it's slightly differently. I think this is quite a book that is readily available online and is also accessible, I think, for many people in our congregations. So Bruce Sanguin is a minister of the United Church of Canada, and until recently was a minister of the Central Church in Vancouver, but recently retired. He has a blog and all that other stuff that people do who put things up on the web. I turned the beginning of this talk as God so loved the world because one of the things that we do often is interpret the world quite narrowly as God so loved human beings, that God sent Jesus Christ. But it's actually God so loved the cosmos, the whole created order. And so it is, language is important. I'm an English teacher and an ESL teacher, so I'm always going to be interested in language. So Elizabeth Johnson, who Vicky Balabanski mentioned on Saturday, wrote a book called She Who Is. And in that, she talks a lot about how language shapes our thinking and shapes our actions and beliefs. So she talked about how difficult it is to describe God. It's like describing the smell of coffee to someone who's never drunk coffee. I think describing the smell of coffee anyway is hard, but there you go. And she talks about how if we have a vision of God as a judgmental God and we are all sinners and that we, have to be beaten into being obedient and stuff, then that will reflect the attitudes that we have and the way we treat people in our congregations. We had have an idea of God as being separate and away and an old man in the sky sort of thing, or certainly a God that's not involved but occasionally intervenes, then that's how we will respond in our life. And so she's saying that language is really quite important, and this is also what Bruce Sanguin is also using as well, and talking about how the language that we have used in our prayers and in our studies and in our preaching reflects an understanding of who we are and who God is, and how we understand ourselves in relationship to the rest of the world. So he talks about the fact that he believes that we've been cheated by having, as we grew up, and particularly in the last few hundred years, but particularly in our generations, we got really involved with the science of it all. And he's a scientist, so he's not decrying science, but we got so involved with the science of it, and we saw it as a mechanical or mechanistic kind of thing, something to be pulled apart and understood. And he says that we have not therefore understood creation as a sacred story, and that we've been cheated of mystery and awe. And that intrigues me about that whole understanding of a sound scientific basis for our beliefs and our actions. But also that he believes that it's really quite important that we have an understanding of awe and wonder. So that he's wanting us to recreate or reconnect or re-find the language of mystery and awe in our worship. And I think those of you who have been to some of the more orthodox churches will know that they are very good at that. They certainly understand that a lot of their language has that idea of awe and wonder to it. So let me go on. The other thing is he talks a lot about Indigenous cultures and their understanding of being part of the land. And then a very interesting comment that you might find be intrigued by is that he said that instead of, as in traditional cultures, both Aboriginal, Pacific Island cultures and others like that we have in our own church, he says that as those children grow up, They are taught the traditional stories and dances and music and told the sacred stories. And it's really important that they understand them, that they learn them. And we see that in a lot of the Aboriginal communities in our own country. But he says what our children get in the Western world is what they learn is advertising jingles. And so what they're learning is about what you can buy and what you can use. And that struck me as something that was a real critique of how we passing on the sacred stories to our children, particularly the sacred stories of creation and of the land. So the creation then, and another sense that Bruce Sanguin talks about is that it's a manifestation of the Spirit of God. And he talks about how the extravagant nature of creation, the diversity of it, the complexity of it, has to be like that in order to reflect the nature of God. And so that enormous creation and enormous diversity and complexity that surrounds us is there because that is the nature of God, and the extraordinary size of the cosmos and the universe. It has to be like that in order to reflect the very nature of God, which was something that I really spoke to me as well. So he then talks about how the creation embodies the divine, which was something that Vicky mentioned as well the other day. So Jesus, and so he talks about how Jesus comes from the earth and is inherent in creation. So let me just read you a little bit. He said, the majority of the world's Christians function out of a cosmology in which a male God located outside the universe makes occasional forays into the cosmos to straighten things out. From his extra cosmic throne, this God controls life on earth by laying down a divine rule book. He came down from heaven in Jesus of Nazareth to save us from the chaos-induced meddlings of Satan in a world that was inherently evil. He has a plan for every one of us, which was established from the beginning of time. Whatever happens to us is what God planned to have happen from the very beginning. And he goes on to say, obviously, this doesn't fit with what we actually know about an evolutionary universe in the 21st century. The universe contains genuine novelty and surprise and an elegant order, which is not imposed, but rather emerges as we trust the divine life within the chaos itself. Jesus did indeed function to bring order out of chaos, but not as an external agent beamed down from a beyond universe. Rather, as a child of the universe, Jesus emerges, born of Mary, from the interior sacred depth of the one God embodied in the earth. And out of his life, death, and resurrection, a new creation emerges. It's an interesting concept that God is embodied in the earth, and Vicky talked a little bit about this on Saturday, about the panentheism, which is that God is within all of creation, and that we don't worship the creation, but we worship the creator. And Elizabeth Johnson has a very interesting concept in her book, She Who Is, where she talks about how the traditional understanding of creation is God from afar creating out there. And she says that's a very male understanding of creation. And she talks about the woman's experience of creation from within, as we become pregnant and the baby grows within us, and we make space for that growing child. And it's really an inherently still, even with today's technology, an inherently mysterious process, and one which until recent technology, we couldn't see inside. And so that concept of God making space within for creation is an interesting idea as well. But it also picks up Bruce Sanguin's idea about the divine being embodied in the creation. Another aspect of Sanguin is that he talks about diversity as a primary expression of beauty. So I wondered what you thought beauty was. He says beauty is the aim of the universe. So what makes something beautiful for you? If you think about it, it often is, it's quite a complex thing. So a beautiful scene is the beauty of the shape or the context or the play of between water and sky or mountains and people and plants, different plants coming together. So if you think of a beautiful scene, it has that complexity, that motion, that form, a dynamic, makes it beautiful. It's not a simple thing to be really beautiful. And so he then goes on to say that sin is the resistance to the divine impulse for beauty. And every time we pollute a river, every time we destroy something, every time another creature becomes extinct, we are hurting that divine embodiment and also making things not beautiful anymore. And how injustice and sin affects the whole earth. So climate change, destruction of habitat, pollution of waterways, etc., overexploitation of resources is a injustice and sin. And if you remember on Saturday, Vicky talked about it as idolatry, being seen as idolatry in Colossians. And she also went on to talk about how St. Paul says all creation groans because of this sense of the destruction of this beautiful world that God has created. You'll also remember that on Saturday, Vicky talked about how we had put ourselves at the center of the earth. And that was the sin of arrogance and idolatry, because if we think of ourselves as always being in the center, then we're the most important people, the most important thing that's happening, and therefore the world around us can be used and exploited for our own ends. And that's a similar thing to what Sanguin is saying in terms of injustice and sin and being a resistance to the natural beauty and order and complexity of the world. He uses a lot of the biblical stories and has a look at those in the light of this understanding of an ecological Christianity, as he calls it. So an interesting one was, if you think about the story of exile being a very significant story for the Jewish people and for Christians, the story of Moses and the people going into exile. Sanguin looks at that as a way in which we link it back to Genesis 3 and people, the humans being put out of the Eden. And so he says in exile, we have a sense of not belonging to the earth. And that's a direct contrast from many of the indigenous cultures, Aboriginal cultures, Celtic understandings, which have a deep connection to the earth and live in harmony with the earth. If we have a sense of being in exile and not being connected to the earth and connected to God in that way, then we continue to put ourselves at the center and continue in this exploitation of the earth. So there's a lot in the book. It's quite wide-ranging in the way it looks at things, but quite accessible in its language and its stories, and the way it's broken up into small sections with boxes every so often of a particular idea in it. so we go to the next one. This is Tim Scorer, is a person who's done a lot of this work, where he takes these books and he's worked on this one with Bruce Sanguin and makes it into a 9-session program that you could use in your congregations. And I used it in Albany and they loved it. They were coming out of a rural, most of them were from a rural background, had been in farming and had retired to Albany. And Albany was a rural, large town in the bottom of WA for those who haven't been there. And so this really resonates with people who are in that rural setting and have a different approach to the land and to how it might be used. So it's currently available online. I looked it up. And so if you wanted to use that in your congregations, that would be quite a useful resource. I don't know of too many other resources like that, so that's why I've shared it with you. Go back. I just want to stop there for a minute. I'll stop sharing so I can see people again, or some people. View, it's gallery up here. So I just wanted to stop there and just give you a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions or any comments you want to make. It's been a fairly quick run through of some of what I think are key ideas of Sanguin's. And so I just wanted to give a chance for anybody who wanted to ask a question, which I will try to answer if I can. I don't pretend to be the expert in this. I'm just sharing some of the things I've done.
Thanks, Wendy. Just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or make a comment.
Nothing? Did you like the idea of beauty being, how did that go with you? No?
Wendy, I was going to say, I always see beauty in a lot of things out in creation, but you know, you might see a spider's web with the frost on it or something, and it really is beautiful. I've never tried photographing snowflakes, but there are lots of little things that we may not see as major items at all, but they are all point to that beauty in creation.
Yes, and that's what he's on about. He says no matter how big or small or you know, where it is, it'll have that sense of that complexity and that contrast, and it's just a lovely concept, I thought.
Wendy,
Yes,
Luann here, about beauty. What about beauty that is not part of the natural world? I'm thinking of a piece of painting or an artwork, a sculpture.
I think Sanguin would see that that is all an expression of who we are and our embodiment. And so, and if you think about pieces of art that other people have done, and so it's an expression of a life form, then it is, they will also have this idea of a synthesis. He talks about it as a synthesis of unity and complexity, stability and motion, form and dynamics. So it's full of even quite simple paintings, if beautifully done, will have form and shape and contrast and some complexity in them. So yes, he doesn't specifically address that issue, but I would say that we learn about what we think is beautiful from our culture, but so that changes across cultures. But he's making that general statement, and we are part of that creation. We're not separate from it.
Wendy, Tim here.
Yes.
You made me think of the American nature mystic writer Annie Dillard, because the world is beautiful in many senses, but it's also wild and strange and weird and not beautiful in any sentimental way. You think of the spider's web, yes, with the dew on it, it is beautiful, but the female spider eating the male spiders after copulation, you know, is that beautiful? That's wild, weird, challenging. So we have to kind of learn to see differently, I think, if we're going to go really into this in some kind of depth.
Yes, I think Sanguin would agree with you, Tim, that we have a very narrow understanding of beauty, and he's really trying to help us to see a much broader sign. Let me just read you a bit from this lovely book. Dava Sabel, some of you might know, she wrote Longitude, and she's written this book called A More Perfect Heaven, which is the story of Copernicus. And Copernicus, as a Catholic priest in the 1500s, and a mathematician who was the first one to say that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but was merely a planet going around a sun, which was part of a bigger galaxy, and there were lots more to come. Against all the theology of the day, and got into terrible trouble because he was a priest and dared to say that the Bible wasn't accurate. And he's in this section, he's has a young acolyte who comes to work with him, another mathematician who's fascinated by Copernicus and what he's doing, and puts himself at some risk by coming to work with Copernicus, because it wasn't a good thing to do. And Copernicus is really trying to help him understand this whole concept, and he says, you know, trying to explain to this young guy that there's the huge distances between the stars and huge distances between the sun and the earth. And he says the distance to the stars is so tremendous that it dwarfs the distance between the earth and the sun. Compared to the distance from Saturn to the stars, the distance from the earth to the sun is negligible. Negligible? Yes, it just shrinks to just a point, really. You're making this up, says the young mathematician. And Copernicus comes back with, in this imagined conversation, don't impose any puny human limits on creation, as though the whole cosmos were just a crystal ball for your own little personal affairs. And the mathematician says, in the name of the creator, then what is the use of all that empty space between Saturn and the stars? And Copernicus says in great temper, the use? What's the use of grandeur, of splendor, of glory? Thus fast, I tell you, is the divine handiwork of the one almighty God. You know, it's that great thing about, we kind of want to make everything fit what we know and are limited by. What I'm going to do now is just simply run through fairly quickly some of the things that I've used in worship, and some ideas, and at the end we'll have some time for you to share that as what you've done as well. So back to this, wherever I was. Okay. This is one that I've used when I was looking at the woman at the well. I found a beautiful prayer, and what I did was put some pictures with it, and then use it as a silent reflection. And I think this is one way we all have access now to these wonderful screens and can put all sorts of things up on PowerPoint. Many of these are my own photographs, but I also pinch a lot from the internet. So I'm just going to run through this much more quickly than I would in a worship service, just to give you some ideas. And so you can read that for yourselves, I hope. Loving God, you are like a mountain spring, source of living water, a stream of never failing love. You're like a summer rain, a sudden benediction, drenching my soul with peace. You are like a raging sea, tossing me over and around as I learn to lean on you. You're like a waterfall, a delightful surprise in the bush, the source of my refreshment in the stress of life. You're like a cleansing flood, a river of reconciliation washing away my self-centeredness. You're like a bottomless well, a cup of life-giving water, still presence in all of our life. You're like a still pool of water, reflecting back to us the image of ourselves, a pool of deep understanding, unconditional love and acceptance. Praise to you, our God, for water, for its coolness, its freshness, its cleansing, its power, its stillness, its renewing, all of us and all of creation. It's simply a way of giving some visual images and some language that helps us to think about, I think, creation in a different way. It may or may not be useful in your congregation, but I've had good responses where I've used it, particularly if you give people time to look at each photograph and to read it slowly as a silent prayer for themselves. I love this photograph. And this is one that I've used as a Thanksgiving prayer to help people kind of expand their sense of gratefulness. And part of the way I've done this particular little section is that to look at the complexity and extravagance and abundance of God and God's creation. So a prayer of praise, I simply say to people, consider the generosity of God, the extravagant abundance of God, and the promises of God. And then look, show them these photographs. Ever wanted to wish upon a star? Well, you have 70,000 million or so to choose from. There's a whole lot of water on Earth. All those million trillion gallons. Hundreds and thousands of plants. Animals everywhere. People of all shapes and sizes. As much food as we need. And we give thanks. So a simple prayer like that. But so you'd give real time for people to look at those photographs, and they're really just trying to give you an impression of the extravagance and abundance and generosity of God. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just a way of thinking about how do we get some of this language and ideas across in our congregations. I did this one with some children. We talked about faith and doubt and all that sort of stuff, things we can't usually see and amazing things in nature. So the Whirlpool Galaxy, Earth from space, the Orion Galaxy. And then things you see with microscopes, the purple armored snout mite that lives in the soil, which I thought was a particularly amazing creature. And the anglerfish from the deep sea. And they were fascinated by these pictures and got all kind of interested in where did they live and why couldn't you see them? This is a blood clot. They thought that was pretty interesting as well. And it's part of a barnacle magnified many times. You could use that in a conversation with adults or in just a reflection with adults and helping them to just kind of, I don't know, expand how they see things. You could use it as a way of how do we talk about things we can't see and things we can't touch and things we can't describe. I don't know, use your imagination. So these are some of the resources I have, which I have enjoyed. This is a particularly lovely book, The Hand of God, Thoughts and Images Reflecting the Spirit of the Universe. And this is one page out of it. So it has a quote from Psalms, it has a quote from John Calvin, and a quote from Flaubert, together with amazing pictures. So they're quite lovely ways in which we can, I love this one from John Calvin. For astronomy is not only pleasant, but also useful to be known. It cannot be denied that this art unfolds the admirable wisdom of God. So even John Calvin was saying that astronomy was opening up new understandings for us of the wisdom and creativity of God. So sometimes just reading some of this stuff to people or sharing it just helps them in their thinking. Many of you will know the Iona community books. This is a particular one, Gathered and Scattered. This poem I thought was pretty would be useful to use in the sense of a confession. After the party, the winding path on nearby hills, a place of beauty as a spring day dawns, and on it I walk lost in wonder, moved by the song of creation, touched by its ever-changing mystery. But all is not mystery here, for suddenly on this gentle path, there are empty beer cans, plastic bottles, cigarette packets, and other debris, scattered in confusion, randomly abandoned as the party ended. Precise markers of our affluence and perhaps of our poverty of vision. And in clearing the mess on this spring morning, my heart is sad, for how can it be that a soul can bypass such beauty? There are some beautiful things around that people have written that can express things that we struggle with. This was lent to me by Joan. Thank you much, Joan. Vicky Balabansky referred to the Earth Bible group in South Australia who've been working for 20 plus years on this project, or even longer, maybe 30 or 40. And this is a particularly lovely book, 7 Songs of Creation, Liturgies for Celebrating and Healing the Earth. It has some really good information in it and some really lovely liturgies. And this is a call to worship that I found in it. God, our creator, who rolled back the waters of chaos to reveal God's earth. Jesus Christ, who became earthly human flesh to reveal God's love on earth. Holy Spirit, who opens our eyes to creation to reveal God's presence on earth. Open our eyes and hearts to discover the wonder of earth, the mysteries of creation, and your presence deep within. So simple things like that, just used from time to time, just begin to change the way we think about things. Wildflower Journey Prayers, a treasured book of mine. I've had it now for quite a long time, still currently available, I discover online. It has the most beautiful photographs of Western Australia and the Northern Territory and the centre, as you can see from this small snapshot. And all through it, it has beautiful prayers, morning prayers and reflections and blessings, just lovely stuff. O God of mystery, as night closes in upon us, we are reminded of our cosmic call to live as people of blessing, to be people of grateful hearts. And quite a variety of people have written in this book. And so it's quite a treasure trove of beautiful prayers and reflections and thoughts. So that's currently available. St. Francis of Assisi wrote a beautiful Canticle of the Creatures, which he talks about the parts of creation as sisters and brothers, doesn't put human beings above things like the sun or the moon or the wind or the water or fire. He talks about them as sisters and brothers, and it's been a very important aspect of St. Francis. And Francis does not see earth and its creatures as subject to humans, but rather as sisters and brothers. All of nature has meaning because it was created by God, and all members of creation he sees as his family. Nothing exists autonomously. So he's the patron saint of ecology, apparently. There you go. From our own church, the Rainbow Spirit Theology has some very, it's a little book, but it's got a lot of treasures in it. And so I would want to suggest that the work of the Congress with the Uniting Church, and for the length of time in our relationship with Congress, has challenged and changed some of the ways we have thought. And as Vicky said on Saturday, she's done a lot of work and gone on country with Aboriginal elders and leaders. And it does change some of the ways in which you think and look. And so we are very blessed by having the Congress as part of the Uniting Church. In the very beginning, the earth was formless and devoid of life. The creator spirit, in the form of the rainbow spirit, shaped the land, its mountains, seas, rivers, and trees. The rainbow spirit is the life-giving power of the spirit active in the world. so they, there's lots of this lovely stuff in there. Human beings are entrusted with the responsibility to cooperate with the Creator Spirit, both to care for and enable the life forces and activate, sorry, the life forces within the land. So as we read some of this stuff, we kind of are challenged to think about cooperating and activating rather than dominating and subduing, and some of the stuff that Vicky talked about on Saturday. This bit really touched me. The Creator Spirit is crying because the deep spiritual bonds with the land and its people have been broken. The land is crying because it is slowly dying without this bond of spiritual life. The people are crying because they long for a restoration of that deep spiritual bond between the Creator Spirit and the land. That'd be an interesting confession, wouldn't it, to think about the spirit, the God crying, the land crying, and people crying, and how we might be restored. Sustainable September, you probably know about. There's weekly resources there from the Uniting Church Assembly for Sustainable September. I think that's going to be a topic of conversation towards the end of the week, so I won't say any more. Climate justice resources for congregations. The Synod in Victoria has a lovely list of resources, which includes practical information on solar panels and energy audits. So there's all that stuff there. So we've got a few minutes for people to ask questions or make some comments. So anybody want to make some comments or share some resources that they've used or they have?
Colin Thompson.
I don't know if I'm on.
I can't hear you, Colin. Whoops.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes. Oh, good. Wendie, I'm just interested in the study that was done in Albany.
Yes.
Did you actually do that study in the one place, or did you actually move into different places while you did that study?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Colin. We did it with the congregation in Albany, so we had 9 sessions with a group of people who came every week. So it was like a short, it was a 9-week Bible study that we ran.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking, did you do it all within the confines of the church or a church hall, or did you actually move out into the wider world?
We mainly did it within, we actually met in people's homes, and the members of the study group brought their information with them, in a sense. They had lived in different parts of the area, and I guess we also knew the area reasonably well. Well, what were you thinking of? Would you go and study something or have a look at something?
Well, I'm thinking of a place that Christine and I went to in America, where they actually had a forest that was used for this type of thing, and people could actually walk into the forest and actually stop at stations. But of course, you didn't have that in Albany, and we don't have it necessarily within our own congregations. But whether in fact you could actually walk into a space somewhere, say along the Ovens River here in Wangaratta, or somewhere else, to actually just get the feeling of the ecology and the connection.
What the study did was enthuse the people to actually work with some other, as a big focus on environmental stuff in Albany and Denmark in particular. And it enthused this little group within the congregation to get involved with some of the environmental groups around the area. And they lobbied the local council to actually set aside a part of the cemetery so they could have eco-friendly burials. And that was a very interesting outworking of this understanding of theology, and then a concern about the funeral industry, which there's a lot of problems with it, and they got involved in lobbying for some change, so that you could be buried standing up, you could be buried in a shroud rather than in an expensive plastic box, and all sorts of other things like that. It was all good fun. And the community was really fascinated by the fact that the church in Albany was talking theologically about the environment, because they thought the church wasn't interested in the environment, and they all were. And so it was a really helpful way of the church being taken more seriously by the community, because it was a community that was really interested in the environment and ecology.
Wendy.
Yes.
It's Robin.
Hi, Robin.
Hi. With the Rainbow Spirit theology, if it's written
Yes.
by the elders,
Yes.
how are they okay with us non-Indigenous people using that work?
Oh, yes, they would like us to, because they want us to understand how they are both Christian and Aboriginal, and how they hold their traditional cultures with their Christianity, because we think it shouldn't go together, but they see that of course it goes together, and that God was in this land for the thousands and thousands of years that they were here. We didn't bring God with us, and so that's why it's been published, and that's why it's readily available. And there's lots of new writings being done by Aboriginal Christians in our church that are really valuable to read. Yeah, for sure. That's why I mentioned it, because I think it's important that we actually know that it's there and read it. It's an old one, it's 1980 something, and there's a lot more of other things since then. Other people with questions? Comments? Resources that you've used?
Wendy, it's Kevin here as a comment.
Yes,
As
Kevin.
a retired farmer, in my life of farming, I've seen where we used to think we could do things on the earth and change it, to come to an understanding that if we work with creation, we get a much better result.
Yep.
And I have seen that as a farming, and I'm interested in now seeing that as something that actually, now looking at eco-theology, is a way in which we can talk about how we're coming to terms with creation and seeing that as God so loved the world, in that it is the world, not us.
Yes.
Which
that was certainly something that the group in Albany got, Kevin. I remember one woman who'd come across from Victoria in the 1950s and taken up marginal land in Western Australia because it was being given to them for free, told they had to clear it. And she said, we now know that that was the wrong thing to do, but we were fined if we didn't do it at that time. And the grief that she had, and the way in which the group worked through that idea that we've all done things in the past that were insensitive and exploitative, and how might we do it differently now? But yeah, I think it's a really important aspect. And I guess it's part of what I'm trying to get you to do in your preaching and leading of worship and any study groups or your own reading. If we begin to use a different kind of language, we begin to read about eco-theology and read Bruce Sanguin and read the other authors that Vicky Balabansky talked about, so that we become better informed, but we use some of these beautiful prayers and things that other people have written, it just begins to change people's thinking. It's a bit like changing farming practices. Takes time.
I was just going to say, Wendy, another resource is Auntie Denise's book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yorta Wonderland. Say a bit more about that, Helen.
Well, Auntie Denise, I think, was the first Aboriginal woman who's ordained in South Australia. Is that correct?
That's right.
And she's written a book here about her stories of the land. But and I guess that's a part of, I mean, I guess I have done some work on eco-theology to some extent, without calling it eco-theology. But yeah, it's about, the relationship of people to the land and like looking at the rainbirds and what they tell us about it. And I remember her also talking about and you might remember better than me, but some of the dreadful things that that we as white people have done to the land in taking away the oil out of the land and so on, and at the same time by destroying some of the traditional elements of the land and things like that. So yeah, it's well worth. It's a lovely story. Yep.
Yeah, she's one of the modern Aboriginal theologians now in the Uniting Church, doing some really interesting work in South Australia. There's quite a few also in the Northern Territory doing some really good stuff as well. You just need to go to the Assembly website or to, well, maybe, but certainly ask around and find out who's got what. Any other concerns, questions, ideas? I've got all this written down and I'm happy to send it to people if you would like some of it, but or you can just watch the this on YouTube again and get some of the titles of the books if you didn't get them down as we went. I'm sorry it's been in a bit rushed, but I kind of thought with an hour I'll just kind of go power through.
It's all right.
So any other questions or comments? Brian, are we close to time?
We're getting close to time, that's right. I was saying one of the advantages of this is unless we've got to race off to watch our favourite program or something or other, we've got cutting into anyone else's time. So if there's comments and discussion.
Okay. So perhaps I might just ask people, in amongst all those words, was there something that struck you in particular that you go, oh, that's interesting, I might follow that through, or that's an idea that I might use? Is there something that you, out of the last hour, that you would like to just tell us about, please? It's about giving me some. So what struck you about the things that I've shared with you?
Well, some of the resources, I think, Wendie, particularly the wildflower journeys, the prayers, reflections and blessings. I thought that's something I'd really like to sort of find out more about. And I guess the idea of finding beauty everywhere, but I guess then you've got the contrast of what did she talk about, but ugliness and sin. I mean, where does all of that sort of, weigh in? So you've got the two things to consider. So yeah, there's lots to think about.
Good. Someone else?
I think it's Kevin again. I just think that now when I sit down and read the Bible looking to take a service, I'll look at it from a different perspective. Before we were thinking of salvation and us, to look at salvation of creation at the same time. There's a way in which rethinking and reusing some of the stuff in the gospel we've seen only in one direction and not others.
One of the things I was, oh gosh, okay. One of the things I was helped to understand when I did my unit on this was that there are threads through the Bible, and there's a very powerful thread of this creation understanding and the relationship of people to it. That's always been there, but we've just ignored it in some ways, or as Vicky said, changed it to kind of be only about us rather than about the whole world. I just think that John 3:16 is such an important verse because it can be so huge and so broad, but I've heard too many sermons that narrow it right down. So other comments other people want to make?
There's another interesting Norm Habel book, Wendie.
Yes. Yes.
Rainbow of Mysteries.
Don't know that one, but he writes great stuff.
It's meeting the sacred in nature.
Yes. Yep. Anyone else? I can't see everybody now. Anything that struck you, anything that you liked, anything you didn't like? If I was in a group, I'd be eyeballing you all and you'd say something. I'd be a good teacher.
Wendie, I thought the passing on the sacred stories, not the advertising jingles, made me think.
But yes, that I kind of got really, I thought,
A
oh gosh,
really
that is true.
pithy little statement. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, yes. As well as the immensity of the extravagance and the immensity of creation.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Wendie, Tim here again, just thank you. The lovely simplicity and in some ways of just offering people some rich images and just a very few rich concepts, and then giving people time to sit with that, and then gathering that up in a kind of shared prayer that's got a lovely shape to it. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think there's so much potential in that, Tim, and it doesn't have to be complicated, but it does need to be thoughtfully done.
Yep.
Thank you.
I need to bow out at this point.
Yes.
Everybody, thank you. See you tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night.
Okay.
you.
Good. I've just got an evening prayer to end with from this beautiful book, Helen, of the Wildflower Journey Prayers. Yeah, I used to have a dozen of these books, and I've given most of them away. So otherwise, I'll give you one. It's called Mother God, Giver of Life, as evening wraps her quiet arms about us, and birds sing the sun to rest. We thank you for the dawn, the day now waning in soft light. Your presence pervaded every step we took. Your gifts brightened our path with joy. We listen tonight with all the wisdom of our spirits. We listen too with all the compassion of our hearts as we savor the words, be still and know that I am God. Thank you, folks. It was a lovely time, a lovely thing to do with you.
Thank you very much, Wendy.
Wendy.
Terrific.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And don't forget, tomorrow night we can come
Not
and
all.
hear about community gardens and how we share our faith through our work in the gardens. And Tanya and Tim are both working on gardens at Benalla and at Axedale, respectively. So we look forward to that. So again,
Thank you.
thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Wendy. That was terrific.
Okay. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.